live, and I will let now people in. So, and we are indeed live. Perfect. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook. So, by just starting by quick introduction.
Internationa camera или camera? Internationa camera. Camera, camera.
Can I please ask you? I hope it's okay. I will. Can I please ask you all to mute yourselves when you do not speak, if possible? Thank you very much. The usual issue with Zoom. So my name is Igor Meheim. I'm one of the co-founders, together with John Jacobs, of the Atlantic Forum. For those of you who don't know Atlantic Forum, we are a NGO which started back in 2019, focusing on engaging young professionals and youth more broadly on questions of on transatlantic issues. More recently, we've started this discussion series called NATO 2030, where we are trying to engage young professionals on issue and give a platform to young professionals to discuss different challenges and threats facing the transatlantic alliance and transatlantic relations more broadly. Last week, or sorry, a month ago, we had a discussion focusing on how we can reinvigorate transatlantic relations and sort of the opportunities and challenges coming with the new administration in Washington, but also discuss some of the priorities for Europe and for Washington to discuss in the coming years. Also, given the changing security environment, and we're following on from this discussion with, I think, one of the biggest issues at the moment that's being discussed out there, and that's the question of China. I remember maybe even a year and a half ago, or certainly when I think back a few years ago, when I worked in a different job, when I worked at the International Republican Institute, and we ran a project focusing on disinformation and malign influence of authoritarian regimes. When we talked about the influence of Russia, and disinformation, cyber attacks, and other threats, other hybrid sort of means that Russia's using, we found that discussion on these issues, people were certainly more open to discuss this than talk about China, because China was for many years, well, we're only trading with China. I mean, China's only interested in trade, but certainly over the last few months, and that discussion has very much changed, and we are focusing more and more discussing, trying to define what challenge China poses for us. And that's really what we are here to discuss today. And I'm really delighted, actually, that I'm joined by three excellent experts, and I should say also many of them good friends, to discuss what kind of a transatlantic approach we can build with regards to China. First of all, again, defining the challenge we face, and then how is it possible that what steps can we take together to face this challenge and address it together. So to do that, first of all, let me introduce Natka Kovalchikova, who's the program manager at the Alliance for Secure and Democracies at the German Marshall Fund. Natka has been working on questions of foreign malign authoritarian influence for a number of years. So it's delight. I'm really happy to have you here. We also have Filip Šebok, who's a research fellow at the Czech Association for International Affairs, He works at the project's Choice Central Eastern Europe, which is focusing on Chinese influence and Chinese presence in Central Eastern, Southeastern Europe. And we also have Jack Herndon, who's actually a former colleague of mine from the International Republican Institute. Jack is a research associate at IRI, where he's focusing on working mainly with political parties and how political leaders can address the challenge of China. So it's I hope I didn't say anything wrong there. I introduced you all correctly, I hope. And let me say thank you again very much for being here. Thank you to the people who joined us on Zoom. Please let me just say that if you are not speaking, please keep yourselves on mute. And as well as having this discussion on Zoom, we are also live on Facebook and on YouTube as well. So this discussion is indeed on record, and so everything you say may be used one day against you, whether that's by Huawei or the Communist Party you choose. Maybe we'll start with a couple of questions to Nadia, to Filip, and to Jack, and then I very much welcome all of you to ask questions. Feel free to ask questions on using the Facebook, YouTube commentary, but also for those of you here on Zoom, feel free to either raise your hand or write your question in the chat box. Let's make this as interactive as possible. So thank you all very much again. And maybe I'll kick this discussion off with Nadia, because I mean, as I said, you worked for a number of years already tracking authoritarian influence, focusing on China, on Russia, Iran, and so on. And so you have watched progressively sort of the growing prominence of China-related issues and Chinese influence creeping in over the last few years. And I would actually be very curious to hear from you about the work you guys have been doing at the Alliance for Secure Democracies, at the GMF, but also how, indeed, maybe tells a bit more actually about this process, how you have seen sort of the issue of China become more prominent, and where in what areas do you see increasing Chinese assertiveness?
Thanks, Igor, and thanks for organizing this important debate. I'm looking forward to discussing with all of us here today. So at the Alliance for Secure Democracy, as you mentioned, we have been looking at strategies, the behavior of especially the authoritarian actors such as Russia, China, and also more recently Iran. And this is a very timely debate because just some days ago, we have expanded one of our tools, which is called Authoritarian Interference Tracker, on which several of my colleagues have been, the whole team basically has been contributing to add more incidents into the tracker. And the biggest kind of expansion of over 160 interference incidents of China have been added just recently. And I think that also is potentially a good example to discuss how to raise awareness of the kind of a bigger package or a whole toolkit that authoritarian regimes have been using to undermine democracies, to interfere into our institutions and processes in democratic countries. So what we focus on, especially in this particular tool, but also in general in our ISD analysis, is it's information manipulation as one of the tools, but then also economic coercion, cyber operations, civil society subversion, but also malign finance. And these 5 tools of interference many times are used in a complementary way. So there is a certain interconnectivity, and the trends and patterns that our work and analysis and also the tool have shown to us. And I invite everyone who is interested to check it out. So for the moment in the tracker, you can see the incidents from Russia and China since 2000. So depending on which countries were impacted by this efforts. So Russia has been interfering in over 40 transatlantic countries that we have been tracking, China in around 20. So it's the most recent expansion. So this is the way how we kind of are looking at, and we are then delivering and helping elaborate more comprehensive cross-cutting strategies to counter such behavior, to help detect or deter against such interference. So as you just mentioned, this is part of a kind of a growing effort. This tool is also a living project, so it's open to expand as the incidents are appearing, or as there is more record of it, or access to information as we are informed. So this is a living tool, the living database that catalogs these interferences and incidents. So something that will continue to grow most likely, as you mentioned. China has been more active also in Europe, in transatlantic space, also during COVID-19, in the information space. So there will be probably more. So something to kind of look forward to or worry about. But it's definitely important to know about, and it helps understanding of not only about the fact that this is happening, but also what concretely happens and when and where, and then be able to better connect the dots. So this is one of the things I would like to mention. I also recently published a NATO policy report on NATO's approach towards China, which I can also elaborate on a little bit if you want now or later.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that in a moment, because there are certain parts of your paper that I definitely want to touch upon, and I think are very relevant for the discussion. But let me maybe turn to Jack for a moment, because I mean, as Nadia was saying, you know, there has been not only increasing assertiveness, but also increasing presence of China across different sectors, different spheres in different countries. I mean, and that has been the case not just before this pandemic, you know, not just during this pandemic, but also before that. But then the big, you know, the question here I have for you, Jack, you know, does China actually have a global strategy? I mean, you know, we've all read, or well, some of us geeks have the, you know, Unrestricted Warfare and, you know, similar books, which make great Saturday night reading if you have no social life. But the question is, you know, does China actually have a global strategy, or is China, quite frankly, making it up as it goes along?
Yeah, I think that the simple answer to that is yes. China has a strategy that it has had reasonable, although not unqualified, success with. You know, by no means is it perhaps Michael Pillsbury's 100-year marathon. I think that we generally do underappreciate how much. I think we do ascribe too much to China's superior planning capabilities and imbue them with a kind of wisdom that perhaps they don't deserve. I think that we generally underappreciate how much China's government is actually just reacting to crises in the short term, and how it's actually unable or even unwilling sometimes to make strategic choices when it needs to, and these turn into like huge strategic blunders. I mean, for example, China has a very unbalanced economy that's highly vulnerable to external shocks because it's mostly driven by trade instead of more sustainable forms of growth like consumption. But it can't afford to sort of make a course correction here because of the huge political backlash it would face from high unemployment. I mean, not to mention that there's still very severe, if not worsening, economic damage caused by its polluting industries that have made most of its land unpotable. But my point is that China is perhaps no better at strategizing than the United States is, for example. But the issue is that the United States strategy has been based on some false assumptions about China for too long now. You know, and now we have to recorrect, whereas they're just continuing course. I mean, when you talk about China's strategy, there's like a few different ways you can think about it. You can look at sort of domestic and regional strategies that have instead global ramifications. You know, like China's quest for energy security. But I think that, you know, what's perhaps best for us to focus on in this discussion is more so China's strategy to enhance its global influence and what insecurities are driving it to do so. I mean, China's political priorities are very simply, number one, to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power, maintain growth, and achieve national reunification, so-called national reunification with Taiwan. In order to do so, it has to do three very large things. It has to sort of address the threats that are posed to it by liberal values that are embedded in the international system. It has to gain and maintain access to export markets and new technologies in order to enhance its terms of trade and sustain a export-driven economy. And it has to continue to foster a benign environment whereby China can sustain any potential international backlash to its territorial ambitions or goals of reunification. So I think that actually the first and the third are really, most prevalent to the work that I do, this sort of creating this benign environment and also redefining these liberal values. That's the most prevalent to the work that I do at IRI, so I'll try and stay focused on those. To address the liberal values, you kind of have to understand really kind of what threat this actually poses to the CCP in order to understand what it's doing in response. In China, there is no higher authority than the CCP. The party is above the law, and it endows and denies rights to individuals where it sees fit, which is really fundamentally at odds with the idea of like universal human rights and the rights to self-governance. So it's kind of been doing two things to kind of address this. First, its primary campaign is to reduce the appeal of democratic values by highlighting their shortcomings, by highlighting the shortcomings of democratic governance to deliver public goods, while also propping up its supposedly superior governance model to deliver, for example, in the aftermath of COVID-19 or the wake of COVID-19. And second is advocating an alternative set of watered down human rights and governance norms that makes actually space for the CCP to maintain its legitimacy, such as very specifically advocating for rights of development and prosperity and social harmony, where thereby becomes the government's mission to deliver on those promises at the expense sometimes of individual rights of property, liberty, and dignity. And so kind of the platforms it's been using to sort of conduct to pursue these strategic objectives has been establishing this global microphone, where it's very specifically what in its own words is trying to break the West's monopoly on discourse power, or its ability to define what values are. And it's very simply, this is simply by extending the reach of CCP media outlets, in order to have greater control over how China is depicted and what its governance model is capable of. And this is paired simultaneously with this use of economic power or sharp power to deter any kind of criticism, so that discourse around China always remains positive, while also, amplifying the negative effect, the failures of democracies. And I think that, in this strategy, I think that, we often make the mistake that we are somehow the target of this, just because all these influence operations are best mapped out in Europe. But really, the focal point is the global South. It's the developing world that China sees as the cornerstone of its potential political power and efforts to mount a countervailing force to the liberal West. And I just have like two points in conclusion. Is simply, from this sort of position of power, or from this base of power or cornerstone of the global South, China is able to use that to sort of reshape international institutions and occupy key positions of leadership, where it can embed its own values and its own rhetoric in a way that normatizes it and also sort of obstructs any sort of efforts to criticize or push back against it, like, obstructing any movements through the UNHCR for its criticizing it for its practices in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And lastly, it uses its economic power as a cornerstone, its economic power to tie countries around the world to it and apply costs to criticizing China. It uses its economic power towards political ends in a way that no other country really does so as blatantly. I think that what really kind of encapsulates that is Hu Xijin's, the editor of Global Times. He's not a government official, but this kind of gets the point across. Threatens to sanction countries that choose to boycott the 2022 Winter Olympics. That's just kind of a way that kind of characterizes China's use of its economic power to sort of criticize and deter political criticism. And the last part of this strategy is just to sow divergent interests between the United States and its allies, divergent economic interests, or even to cast doubt on the value of U.S. treaty obligations in order to change those strategic calculuses. And so I think that with our limited time available, I think that's as much of China's guiding strategy that I'd be able to touch on.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much, Jack. And Filip, then let me turn to you. I mean, Jack just talked about all these different sort of principles, and Nadia talked about these very, very much different areas where we see increasing Chinese influence. So let me ask you, I mean, if you were to conceptualize the challenge China poses to us, I mean, how would you define it? Because, I mean, often we talk about this idea of a new Cold War, right? But China is not, I mean, certainly it's not a declining power like the Soviet Union, and neither is it necessarily, does it have millions of soldiers on our borders? In fact, we trade billions, if not trillions, with China regularly. Its companies are present in Europe. Our companies are present in China. There's significant exchange and interdependence. So how do we understand actually this challenge? How would you define it?
Thank you, Igor. So really, like Jack in his excellent presentation just now, like mentioned many of the things that actually touches upon the challenges, because it, of course, Chinese strategy translates to actual challenges that the West, whatever we define it, is facing in terms of Chinese rise. So first of all, really to follow up on what Jack has said, and I think it's really important to point out the fact that China's leaders have really seen themselves as being embroiled in a long-standing ideological competition with the West, and they really see the Western ideals of democracy, all these ideals. There's this famous document that basically lists all of the issues that we at Western in the Western world in general hold dear as fatal enemies of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's the freedom of the press, it's freedom of expression, it's the whole electoral democracy, everything. Basically, that stands in direct contrast to what Chinese Communist Party stands for. So when we hear China now, and also like a lot of the discussions about the new Cold War, and they always kind of trace it back to the Trump administration. Of course, that's partly the truth. But reality is that China has, for a long time, seen themselves as embroiled in this. We talk about decoupling. China was the one to start internet decoupling, for example, via its Great Firewall, all the other efforts it has made to basically shut out itself of the global system. And the thing is, they believe they're winning this ideological competition. And we have seen a lot of triumphalism from Chinese state media, from Chinese leaders this past year. We can really trace it back, to financial crisis, first of all. Maybe that was like first time when they actually realized, because there was this belief, okay, China is maybe not gonna reach the level of power of the United States, for example, for a long time. Now they realized, okay, so there is a global crisis that actually started in the US. Maybe it's not that far that we're actually gonna achieve this status of superpower. Then you had a series of populist victories in Europe. You had Brexit. You had Trump. And now you have COVID. So it's really, like, from China's perspective, it's not that difficult to understand why they see themselves as having this long streak of victories. And to get to the challenges, so of course, China is a country, Chinese Communist Party, because it's often China really, what we're facing, the threat we're facing is represented by the Chinese Communist Party. It represents completely different values from, as I said, from what is represented by liberal democracies in the West, and completely different global political order. Of course, it's not a the issue here, we're talking about transatlantic cooperation within the NATO framework, for example. So as of right now, of course, China is not a direct military threat to Europe, for example. Anyway, there's still a lot of flashpoints that are all around China's borders, whether it's the border with India, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's the East China Sea. So still, it's a potential. There's a huge potential for basically destabilizing developments. Whether it's Taiwan, of course, which I didn't mention, that will, of course, have huge impact on the stability, security, also the Euro-Atlantic area. Then, of course, China is a huge technology power. It's the country that is now trying to basically put forward standards for future technology, and it's very interesting to compare it, what also the debate on China that we have right now, and we had 20 years ago, it was like China, they are like flooding us with the toys for kids, and now it's like they're flooding us with, with 5G technology. So it's very huge change that we have seen. So of course, China is still the country that is, there's a record of infringement of IP rights, and all of that is true. But perhaps we're going to be the ones who need to, step up our game. And in some areas, of course, China also is not, sometimes we're making up them to be what they're not. But still, they made huge progress in many areas. Then, we have we have seen for the first time this past year that China has really put a lot of effort into disinformation on a global scale, which we have seen not from China before. And this is really connected to the fact that China is now like a global power, it's a global topic. This really, everybody realized, of course, with COVID-19. And we are sure to see more of it as China's interests grow stronger all around the world. So this is perhaps a natural development. Of course, there's a lot of other issues that we are kind of popped up these past few years. Chinese corrosive capital in Europe, the Chinese basically predatory investments, corruption practices, then the issue of also touching upon the issue of Chinese investment, the control of strategic infrastructure, whether it's ports, for example, in Europe, which China has been buying up, its control of the 5G networks, and then also the strategic dependencies that China is creating in some areas, whether it's like dependence on China-centric supply chains, and all of these issues. So there's a myriad of issues that somehow we have come to realize just these past few years, and it's been really an avalanche of this. And what I would like to make a point of what really China, or what is a big part of the challenge that's coming from China, is that China, there's not necessarily China as an active actor behind all the negative developments, for example, that we're seeing in Europe. But what China often operates is that it is a huge enabler. It's making use of strategic use of deficiencies, of weak spots, for example, that we have in European unity, of the inability really of the European Union to successfully integrate, for example, the Balkans countries into the EU. And it's really often, it's not that China is using the states or, particular countries like Serbia or Hungary, but it's actually the other way around. So when you have authoritarian or quasi would-be authoritarians in form of Orban or Vučić, we're using this huge force of China to achieve their own political goals. And of course, if there was no China, they would probably have to, invent it, or they would use something else. Like Vučić has been used in Russia, now he's switched to China. So I think it's oftentimes very good to understand that the challenge is really coming from our weaknesses, where basically the weaknesses that we have are being China exploits, and this is where we really need to step up our game. So this is not to say, I guess often you hear that, it's not that China is a problem. It's, we have to first, get our act together. But it's the big part. It's really true. So that we really need to make a better job in various areas to really face up to the challenge that China is for the EU for the transatlantic space.
Yeah, thanks, Filip. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, this point you made about the Chinese victories. I mean, you're absolutely right. They're also our defeats. And the first of all start with us. I mean, just let's look at Borrell's trip to Moscow 2 weeks ago, where we certainly don't help ourselves. I mean, heavens forbid if we allow Borrell to go to Beijing one day. I dread to think what will happen. But you're absolutely right that there are, as also Jack was saying, that there are certainly vulnerabilities in our own societies and in the democratic countries, which we also must address. And that also includes the increasing creeping of authoritarianism in some EU countries, or certainly in countries in our neighborhood. But Jack, let me actually turn to you just for us to move a little bit to the other side of the Atlantic, because I mean, over the last few months, or certainly over the last few years, I mean, one thing. Yeah, for all the criticism of Trump, and there's a fair few to be had, let's be honest, he did bring China on the table, the issue of China on the table, as with many other uncomfortable topics, which before people didn't necessarily want to talk about. Now, whether his approach was right or wrong is, of course, disputable, like the trade war. But my question to you is, I mean, how do you think, I mean, now we have the new administration, which, and certainly we haven't seen anything that suggests that for them the issue of China is going away, or that they of a sudden see China as a cuddly panda bear. So my question is, I mean, obviously now we're having this review of the China strategy taking place, but how much actually do you think the new administration will differ from the old administration in terms of, I mean, A, its approach towards China, and B, towards working with its partners in addressing the issue of China?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think actually the United States had a pretty coherent strategy towards China even over the last 4 years, and the main problem with it was the man implementing it. We actually, I think over the last few weeks, a lot of strategic documents have been declassified, so we can actually see what was guiding those thoughts. And yeah, I think that you're right, that Trump actually does deserve a lot of credit for rekindling the debate on how the United States should be, working with and engaging with China, and actually forced our allies to do a lot of the same things. But even for a lot of the things that we would criticize Trump for, like more unilateral impulses and a retrenchment of U.S. responsibility in the world, I think it was actually, his impulses are pretty well grounded in the assessment that U.S. influence and power is based on strength at home, and it's also finite, and that it needed to avoid this strategic overreach, regroup its assets, and consolidate its allies, and then proceed on a more prudent foreign policy with a narrow set of U.S. national interests. And arguably, this is a bit of a tangent, but arguably that's actually an extension of Obama era policies, in light of the 2008 financial crisis. But really, the Trump administration, I mean, the real success was the senior officials inside of it. While Trump definitely rekindled it, the senior officials inside the U.S. administration really were the first to tease out and fully appreciate the extent of China's challenge to democratic norms and values, and really call out that the current course of maintaining economic engagement wouldn't be sufficient to change China's behavior or correct these deep structural issues in the long term. And so, when you actually look at the report card of the Trump administration on China, it's fairly impressive, actually, when you can see it from now. The free and open Indo-Pacific was something that they adopted very early on in the administration, which pushed towards consolidating a team of like-minded democracies in the form of the Quad. They continued to reposture U.S. military assets, with a greater focus on the Indo-Pacific and the China challenge by freeing up assets or resources in the Middle East. And they also put very, very large economic costs, applied very high economic costs to China's unfair trade practices and economic coercion in a way that really no other country has before, with a full use of the gamut of U.S. economic tools, such as, sanctions and export controls and limiting Chinese companies' access to international financial markets, and directing that towards specific Chinese companies guilty of or accused of industrial espionage. And so some of the successes were which we can see actually in Europe is the Trump administration embarked on a campaign to box out Huawei from the 5G network, at least within the community of U.S. alliances through the Clean Network or the Blue Dot Initiative. And then it also sort of pushed our transatlantic allies also to sort of think about the implications of connections with universities that are connected to the PLA. And talk about, and they spoke more frankly than anybody else about the nature of united front work or how China does sort of leverage, the open and porous nature of our democracies. I think that perhaps, they didn't have a great sort of record on human rights, given that they did use Hong Kong as a piece of leverage in securing the Phase 1 trade deal. But they did apply substantial costs to individual CCP officials, and companies for the role that they played for setting up a modern-day surveillance state in Xinjiang, and cracking down on human rights in Hong Kong. But the question really at the end of the day is, was it successful vis-a-vis China? At least on economic issues, I think that we've had some concessions, and it's definitely the pressure applied from the United States that contributed to China coming to the table with Europe on CAI negotiations. And we've also seen internally a de-emphasis on the Made in China 2025 agenda, which does indicate some sort of success. But the real success of the Trump administration was really this sort of strategic, complete, fundamental rethink in the United States on how to approach China inside of the Beltway. And so then the question of how much consistency there's going to be between that and the new Biden administration. Because of the steps that the Trump administration took to lock a certain trajectory in place that made complacency and a strategic vacuum towards China, intolerable, we're likely to see a lot of continuity between the position of the previous government and the current government. I think that the Uyghur genocide issue is perhaps the most exemplary. We know that Pompeo did that in his last few days, and it was a position that current Secretary of State Blinken was forced to also adopt himself during his testimony, congressional testimony. So I mean, that really to me shows the power that the Trump administration had to also continue to influence the current administration. But where we're likely to see a sort of change is really not in strategy or the points where we take issue and conflict with Chinese values, or not Chinese values, CCP values. But really, there's going to be a larger sort of divergence in tactics. Perhaps one, just like what I said, there's perhaps not going to be as large of an antagonization of the entire CCP, a party of 90 million people. And perhaps more targeted, focused approach towards individuals, and taking measures aimed at exacerbating some inter-party factional strife, because Xi Jinping is not without enemies inside of China. We're going to see more communication with allies. I think that's already been very apparent, and a less mercantilist approach, where broader cooperation and support are needed. I think that's perhaps the most obvious in Europe, and sort of reversing the decision to relocate troops from Germany. We'll see a re-engagement and a competition for leadership in international institutions in order to roll back China's engagement there. And we will see, I anticipate that we'll see a fundamental restructuring of the US government in order to improve the interagency process to address the China challenge in a way that sort of removes the silos and connects those boundaries. So from what we know about the Biden administration so far is really kind of, we don't have too many public statements. We only really can kind of go with who he has tapped to occupy key positions inside the administration, mostly within the NSC, because the other positions haven't been able to get through Senate yet. But in the NSC, I mean, NSC advisor Jake Sullivan doesn't prescribe to any idea that China has only has limited regional aims. He sees the ambitions of the CCP as fundamentally revisionist and aimed at contesting U.S. leadership. So that is very consistent with the previous administration. I think that another point of divergence, though, is going to be the role that democracy and human rights will play in the Biden administration. It's really going to zero in, and it's also really going to zero in on the aspects of China's foreign policy that aim to undermine or subvert democratic processes, like that are largely informed by the work that Nadia's organization does. Given that Laura Rosenberger, who is the former director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, is now an advisor to Rush Doshi on the NSC. And I think that one last appointment that kind of really sort of demonstrates this new direction is Shanti Kalathil, who was the former director at the International Forum at the NED, who is now currently the coordinator for democracy and human rights. And while she was at the NED, most of the research that was really conducted there was focused on China and these tools of influence and coercion. So we were seeing a very informed and high capacity China team really zeroing in on the issues of interference in democracies, while also maintaining or not hesitating to acknowledge the full extent of China's challenge systematically to our interests.
Thanks very much, Jack. And can I just also remind everyone, if you have any questions, for those of you live on YouTube and Facebook, and for those of you here on Zoom, please do send in your questions, or feel free to raise your hand. I think let's make this as interactive as possible. So we're very much open to your questions. The only people we do not welcome questions from are those fake accounts which are spamming our Facebook at the moment. But I hope they are nothing to do with the CCP, and if they are, well, too bad. We'll continue with the discussion. But in any case, I mean, Nadia, I'll turn to you in terms of just to build on what Jack was saying in terms of the alliances, because this is really, I mean, not only central to what we want to discuss here today, but also central seems to Biden administration's approach. And let me ask you, I mean, you wrote a very fascinating paper, I have to say, and thank you very much for that, a few months ago, focusing on NATO's role on countering China. And let me ask you, I mean, what do you think actually should be NATO's role? I mean, NATO as an organization is a very specific defense alliance, and it was created as such. So, you know, considering all these different factors we discussed, you know, about talking about Chinese presence, Chinese influence, its growing assertiveness, what role do you think NATO as a defense alliance can actually play in countering Chinese influence?
Thanks, Igor, and I appreciate, and I'm glad that some points in the paper were interesting. Well, I would maybe reframe it a little bit, because
all of the paper was very interesting. So
all of it, okay.
And may I just say, may I just quickly butt in to say, for those of you who haven't read Nadia's paper, have a look on. I believe it's also on GMF's website, but also on Women in International Security's website. So. And I'm happy to share it after the discussion. So sorry for butting it.
No, and thank you. Now you rose the expectation really high. So, but thanks so much for the promo. Actually, it's co-written with Gabi Tarini from RAND. So it's been a great collaborative effort to come up with some recommendations. And we were coming from the premise of NATO being political and military organization. So really looking into the role that NATO can play in 3 areas. So in the political, military, and technological areas, to be better prepared and address the rise of China in the world affairs. And so, as you said, this is an alliance which is really a very known to be a defensive alliance, so does not have the offensive strategies, and it's rather to work along the three core tasks that definitely do apply when we are going to discuss further and address China. So the collective defense, which is the primary core task, but also the crisis management or the cooperative security, so the cooperation with the partners. And I think here we could discuss all three core tasks where NATO, which NATO can leverage to address China in the future. As several of you mentioned, China is not a military threat at the moment, so I would focus more on those political and technological ways to address China. NATO has been much more vocal about the need to raise it since the leaders meeting in London in December 2019. So it's relatively recent increased attention to understand China's intention, the activities, the tools, but also the behavior overall in the security environment that matters for the NATO allies and partners. So that also reflects the fact that there is still a lot of work to develop. Of course, China has been present in other conversations that were related to NATO's security internally or at the borders already to a certain extent, but this increased focus since the end of 2019 really boosted this conversation and gave much more attention. And since then we have seen a lot of the discussion what NATO could and should do. At the Munich Security Forum a couple of months afterwards, beginning of last year, both the EU and US representatives very clearly focused on China, and a lot of the panels focused on China and how we can approach China in a more transatlantic manner. And so therefore NATO seems a kind of a natural vehicle or organization where this could be achieved. So, for example, one of the very important things is to leverage the committees and the partnerships NATO has already. So before developing the new kind of committees and tools and units, which I do think will be important as well, leveraging, for example, the enhanced partnerships with Australia or the important partnership with Japan and the countries in the Indo-Pacific that have a long-standing and deep experience with interactions with China is going to be critical and very helpful for the allies, and will also contribute to the more inter-regional cooperation and therefore maybe also understanding, but also the approach that is going to be more effective in that sense. Also, we could discuss the exercises. So of course, NATO has been very active in preparation phases, preparedness and exercises. So incorporating the aspects that are more perhaps digital or technological advancements of China and how it potentially influences our North Atlantic area or European allies. And it's very important to include in those exercises and take it into consideration that a lot of the technology that is being developed or being acquired or looked at by China has both a civilian and military use. And so because there has been a lot of, as also Filip mentioned, strategic investments in critical infrastructure, be it from the telecommunications or transportation, energy or ports and roads and rails and all of this. It's a critical infrastructure that is used for military mobility and would be used if necessary in the times of the crisis. So getting this kind of investments in this critical infrastructure can have a political and security implications that I think we need to be really aware of and address it as such. So not purely civilian and purely commercial, as there has been already mentioned and in the beginning, and as China many times tried to portray it, it's a pragmatic, commercial investment and it's about the trade. Well, it's also about the security. I think here NATO really has a role to play from the political perspective. For example, also for the investment screening mechanism. The EU has established the investment screening mechanism. Each member state of the EU should have their own national screening mechanisms in place fully already, but it's also about the implementation of those and taking into consideration perhaps increased sensitivity when it comes to screening the investments into these sensitive sectors, technology sectors, for example, to be more precise, but also, as we mentioned, the energy or the other types of critical infrastructure. And here NATO can play an increased role in mobilizing and encouraging also the EU member states. I mean, most of the NATO allies are the EU member states, so there is, of course, a clear overlap of interest and security interest, where where NATO plays an important role in making sure that these issues are on the agenda quite high, also at the EU level. So, I mean, there are several other recommendations that we mentioned in the report, and I would be happy to discuss in more detail as well. But I do think that NATO really can leverage its political influence and the fact that most of its allies are actually the member states, and that this is a really more global democracy alliances, as you mentioned, potential there, where with the partners of NATO and potential more information sharing and some kind of a consultative body would be really, really helpful. I mean, if we speak about information sharing, we can also think of the development of the new units that would allow within the allies to kind of enhance that and have more focus on potential coordination efforts between Russia and China, or between the authoritarian actors overall, which would have impact on our security and democracy within the alliance or with the partners. There has been a very interesting report as well by the expert group as part of the NATO review process 2030. And there are quite a few interesting proposals as well, and quite a bit of attention to addressing the rise of China's influence and how it's important to really get a deeper understanding, more resources and attention to that at the NATO level. So I think we do see there is a lot of interest. We do see there is also the recognition of the challenges. I mean, at the NATO's leaders meeting, it was challenges and opportunities. In our paper and in our discussion, I think we are so far focusing much more on the challenges that it can pose. But if we speak about democracy and the values and principles of democracy, there are other ways of alliances, like in the European Parliament, the Interparliamentary Alliance, right, between not only the European countries, but with the EU countries, but also with UK or the US or Australia, Canada, that can play an interesting other role to also from these more democratically elected representatives alliances. And I think there are ways to explore such cooperation in addition to the existing institutional bodies and approaches already.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a follow-up on that, because I mean, of course, I fully agree with what you say in terms of, you know, the role NATO should play here in sort of bringing that transatlantic approach. But at the same time, you know, there is also the question of the EU, what role the EU can play and how NATO and the EU can actually complement one another. And I mean, NATO EU cooperation is something we've been talking about for years in many different spheres. And you know, I mean, so where do you think, I mean, when it comes to China, actually, the two, you know, what are the areas that where the two can cooperate? I mean, there was one suggestion I read, I think, on Friday in Financial Times, where someone talked about an economic Article 5, which can be triggered, which for the, well, you know, a very interesting idea, but also I'd like to see how that would actually play out in practice. You know, so my question is, you know, how can they actually, these two organizations, work together? And to be fair, I mean, also speaking honestly, can they work together given also their previous histories of coordination and more lack of coordination than coordination?
Tough questions. I do think they can work together also with regards to China, both NATO and EU have been much more vocal about the systemic rivalries or the challenges and the importance of coordinating efforts with other democracies to be more effective when addressing these challenges of China's rise and their more increased assertiveness and activity in different areas. So yes, the short answer would be yes. I do think so. Yes, there have been, there are certain limits that I think we are aware of, where not all the EU member states are the NATO allies and the other way around. And so there are potentially diverging some, to a certain extent, perhaps some national interests, but that's what it is, and it has always been and always will be to a certain extent, but doesn't prevent from any kind of further collaboration, especially, for example, as you mentioned, there are the areas of asymmetric threats, and NATO and EU have actually increased collaboration and tackling hybrid threats, asymmetric threats through the both joint communications that have been already signed between the High Rep of EAS and also the Secretary General of NATO, and these joint communications do focus a lot on the measures that do address the asymmetric threats. So for example, there is potential in that area. So talking about the cyberspace, talking about disinformation, talking about these non-military areas, technology as well, where I do see potential for increased cooperation. Also, when we speak about more geographical way to approach it, EU has a lot of investments, a lot of knowledge, for example, from the Western Balkans region, and a lot of cooperation with Western Balkans. Many of the countries are aspirants for the EU membership. And so there are close ties. And as I think it was Jake who mentioned that, yes, there are both, maybe Filip as well, there have been increased attention of China towards Western Balkans. We see it with Serbia, we also see it with other countries, the investments as well, or the promises of investments. There, I think EU and NATO definitely have also another, in this case, geographical area where they can share their knowledge and experience and the capabilities that already exist to deal with these challenges within the Western Balkans region, which is a neighboring region of the EU, but very much integrated in a lot of the policies of the EU and NATO historically as well, but also capacity-wise. So there are complementary areas there. And maybe just lastly, when we speak about, as it was mentioned, and I think, of course, this is a highly important issue of the 5G investments. This is, we have seen that it does not have only purely economic implications, but also potentially the security implications when we speak about some vendors and long-term strategic implications. And in those cases, I think, especially when it comes to this type of sectors or this type of issues that really have a longer, very long-term impact on the security and safety and stability of the allies and of the partners, democratic partners, there needs to be and should be, and I think will be also, we will see more of the coordination of the efforts also between NATO and the EU.
Thanks, Nadia. And I mean, Filip, what about you? I mean, what do you think about this division of labor between sort of US, what on one hand, what NATO can do, what the EU can do? I mean, we also have this, I mean, that was before the elections. There was this also this idea of having a US-EU dialogue on China, as a sort of a separate path. And I mean, certainly we in the European Parliament, we are also pushing for a specific parliamentary dimension of that, which is important. But my question is, I mean, realistically, how do you see this division of labor? I mean, will it work, or is it possible, or are we just going to blunder through, if you to put it mildly?
Thank you. So as you mentioned, Igor, this has been an issue, ever since NATO has existed, since with the continuation of EU integration and its own, also defense efforts, and EU unsuccessfully for many years trying to become a real foreign policy actor. So, and China presents, of course, a unique challenge in this respect. Honestly, even within the EU, also, of course, within NATO, we still do not see eye to eye on the issue of threat perception of China. So and this was really driven home by comprehensive agreement on investment. So basically, we still talk about this idea of a common China policy. I'm not sure. This is not really something that's going to be happening, I guess, ever, because there's never going to be like a completely unified stance on China, and there's not a completely unified stance on, I guess, any other foreign policy issue. So this has been also kind of an excuse, really, on many times to basically say, like, whether we're not unified, we cannot really do anything. But with comprehensive agreement on investments, this was a really big success for China, and also the way EU has presented it. Like symbol of strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is a favorite term in China. They love it. They refer to it very often in the official communication as well. So they want to support it. Of course, this has been a long-term goal of China to drive wedge between the EU and the US. So they've been very supportive to an extent, of course, to EU becoming a foreign policy actor, which they kind of want to be separate from the US, but still kind of toothless. And CAI kind of proved that's kind of what's happening. So it's still going to be very, very difficult, I think, charting a common approach within this transatlantic area. One thing is that also the EU countries have been using Trump as kind of an excuse. Like it's difficult to work with the Trump administration. Of course, they're unilateralistic. Like all of this, it's true. They didn't care about allies. Like they basically attacked China with countermeasures in trade at the same time as they attacked the EU. All of this is true. At the same time, now we have a different administration in the White House, and we see that suddenly it's really like common transatlantic approach is not that easy. So this from the beginning, this was really a big excuse. What I actually kind of am afraid that might be happening in some form is that, and I'm not saying, I'm not giving like a percentage of probability to that, but for example, we have seen again in Central Eastern Europe, for example, some countries being more paradoxically, of course, attuned to or more receptive to US arguments and regarding China, and also having, of course, their own security issues with China, their own experience of China not delivering the promises of investments and increased trade and so on. So actually, I kind of see in some ways this division, the old division of new old Europe again coming up. I think it was very interesting, the contrast, for example, that we had just these 2 months. We had the signing of, or the not signing, but the announcement of the agreement of CAI, where Macron for some reason showed up as well, and it was like a high-profile political event, success for China. You could actually see these images in Xi Jinping's New Year message when it was like played on the background as like, the biggest achievement of the year. And then like 2 months after that, you had the meeting of 17+1 format, where actually many leaders from CE failed to show up. It was a big embarrassment for Chinese leadership, for Xi Jinping himself, who chaired the summit for the first time. So there are big divisions, and I think it's gonna be very difficult to overcome them. But all the issues that Nadia mentioned, and I completely agree on that. One thing where the EU can really, and NATO as well, can leverage maybe where it has advantage over China is really the network of partnerships, of like-minded countries. One thing that is very important about what China represents currently, of course, China is a huge challenge. At the same time, China really doesn't have a network of allies. It has, it has North Korea, of course. It has the Steel brothers in Pakistan, and the increasingly close relationship with Russia, but still didn't really have what the EU has, what NATO has, also in the Pacific area with Japan, South Korea, to some extent India now. So I think that it's very important to leverage that, and it's apart from information sharing, sharing knowledge, it's also important to build up national capacities for understanding China. I'm not sure if it's really China's or if it's NATO's role to do that. But for example, in terms of really like national funds going to that's really abysmal. Like for example, all the research that I feel like most of the research that's happening, for example, in Czech Republic on China is not really funded by the national government. They have not really paid attention to that. We have seen, like in Sweden, I think they established an institute, National Institute for, I'm not sure what's the name. It's basically going to serve as a knowledge base for informing their own China policy. So I think we also should, apart from sharing the knowledge, we should build up the knowledge to be shared. So a lot of practical challenges. I think in Nadia's paper, there's going to be even more. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. I mean, this was in many ways also harks back to 2013, 2014, when we realized that there was very little actually Russia expertise out there, which was one of the big problems Western countries faced, where we for so long we didn't invest into good Russia expertise, and in many ways that also came to haunt us. And it was very interesting to actually see in those times, how many people were commenting on Russia who quite frankly never dealt with Russia before. There were so many newborn Russia experts appearing, and in many ways it's also happening with China, I see, and that's why
the very same thing is happening.
And that's why it's always good to have people who are sinologists and who follow country and regional issues indeed. But Jack, I mean, let me also talk about what Filip just mentioned about this question of lack of a transatlantic approach, also limits to what to having a transatlantic approach. I mean, do you think, in many ways, I mean, on one hand we have the Germans who, quite frankly, their policy is to not have a policy. We have the perfidious French. So my question is, are we going to be back to sort of the coalition of the willing approach that we've as before? Are we going to be back to quite frankly a French president telling Central and Eastern Europe again to shut up? So
yeah,
how do you see this? I mean, do you really think we can build this approach, or rather it's going to be a more of a patchwork of states working together to address China?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we were to take it at face value today, that's where we would end up, but it's not necessarily where we have to stay. Definitely, I think it's true that all of the problems in the transatlantic relationship did not fly to Florida on January 20th. We're still dealing with them. However, I think that perhaps the head of state you mentioned what Macron is doing in the German policy. However, there's still pretty strong factions within those national parliaments that are fairly hawkish on China, right? And I think that that's actually one of the bright spots for potential transatlantic cooperation on China is through parliaments and the legislative branch in the United States. You know, you've got a very strong. I think, like, really in the UK, you can see what a very strong, tight group of acute China watchers can do to sort of change national policy, right? And so I think that that's mostly where our job lies, is finding those groups of people and working with those groups of people and strengthening those sort of factions in order to sort of really facilitate a more international and transatlantic discussion on China outside of simply state-to-state discussions, because the parliaments still do have power to sort of exact costs on Chinese behavior. You know, I think this one thing that really sort of exemplifies all this is the International Parliamentary Alliance on China, which is you know, has support, strong support in the U.S. Congress and also in the European Parliament, which is actually really the most hawkish European institution on China. So I think I'm a short-term pessimist and long-term optimist on this issue of transatlantic approach to China. I do think that you know, like, you're very astute to point out the difficulties of EU-NATO cooperation, especially, you know, how do you sort of do this sort of how do you turn NATO into an economic organization, have like an economic Article 5, like you said, is perhaps a little bit infeasible. But you know, that article you read does actually have a very good point, though. It's like we do need collective action in order to dissipate pressure, because it's I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, but it's usually the ability of trying to single out individual countries that deters others from ever speaking out, or not even individual countries, but individual people. And with a community or with a platform, I think that we'd be able to overcome that. And I think that really the parliament is the place to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I very much agree with you, having to deal with that indeed every day. But listen, let me change, because we have a question here from Nico Segers, who's asking about the Chinese military bases. And he's mainly asking about the military bases in Djibouti, but also in Tajikistan, on the Chinese-Tajik-Afghan border. And, you know, he's asking to what extent are those bases aligned to China's One Belt, One Road route and geostrategic interest? I mean, are the two interlinked, and you know, or do you feel that these are actually simply separate initiatives from the PLA? And let me also actually maybe ask a follow-up question to that. I mean, when we're talking about the One Belt, One Road, you know, on one hand we have the US with its Blue Dot network, which was launched by the US administration, and in Europe we also have the connectivity strategy, which, fair enough, I mean, the EU is still actually to define what it means by connectivity, but leaving that aside, you know, I mean, as a follow-up question to Nico's question, do you actually think that maybe, you know, the Blue Dot network, the connectivity strategy of the EU, do you think they have the potential of actually challenging China's sort of geostrategic and actually economic influence in not just in our neighborhood, but also beyond? And I mean, I'm happy to, I don't know, whoever wants to answer, I'm happy to happy to give you the floor. I'm not picky, whoever wants to answer.
I mean, I could just kind of head that off, right? You know, with regards to the connectivity strategy, I mean, what we know about One Belt, One Road is it does kind of facilitate some strategic corruption at times, and definitely outside of the EU framework. And so it's like that really became apparent in like the last 17+1 initiative, and kind of read out of that a slew of sort of agreements and economic agreements with countries all outside of that were all not EU member states, and basically nothing inside of the EU apart from in Hungary. And so what that means for the connectivity strategy is effectively, you know, you get to sort of do the infrastructure on your own terms and sort of head off China's usual inroads to sort of to build its economic influence in a given country. So very much so. I mean, I think that's kind of directly, you know, applicable. As far as China's military bases in Djibouti, I mean, that's like a big, that's a whole other question about, sort of, the security of its slocks and its sort of energy security and whatnot. But I mean, the obvious answer to that question is yes, of course it's interlocked, to make sure that China has access to energy and resources should it ever sort of face any kind of pressure in those strategic chokeholds, definitely within like the One Belt, the first island chain. But yeah, that's my first stab at that question. I don't know if anyone else wants to kind of jump on there.
Yeah, if I may, I don't really see that as some kind of part of a big effort for China to become more involved in terms of like actual military presence on the ground abroad. But it's interesting because with Belt and Road, like from the very beginning in the debates about this project or whatever it is, because it's not really a project, it's a branding initiative for Chinese foreign policy. But like in terms of actual, for example, countries that are kind of pivotal in terms of infrastructure, whether it's like energy infrastructure or transport infrastructure, the issue has always been that there's there are big security ramifications for these projects, like in Central Asia, in Pakistan, these highly unstable countries, with domestic terrorism problems, separatist problems, you name it. So the question from the beginning to what extent will China become involved in also in providing the security? Because China has always been kind of seen as the country that's not really involved in providing security, really living off, like, for example, the US. That's interesting that basically China has, and its rise has been supported also by the fact that the EU supported security infrastructure and global order has enabled it to basically grow peacefully, with leg of like larger regional conflicts and so on. So I think definitely with China's increased presence, there's going to be, it's completely, I think, expected, and it makes actually sense when China is getting more involved. There's going to be more need for China to also provide security, to provide security, of course, for its investments. In Pakistan, there's like this is actually taken care of like Pakistani army, and there's a huge, I don't remember the exact number, but I think there's tens of thousands, basically Pakistani soldiers who are tasked with protecting Chinese projects. So definitely these are security implications. But I don't feel like we are going to see like Chinese military bases popping up all around the world just because of the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is probably not a viable or realistic concern for some time to come.
And I mean, talking about Chinese initiatives, because you mentioned the 17+1 a little while ago. I mean, everyone likes to talk about 17+1. It makes the Germans nervous. It makes the European Commission nervous. And there are, of course, questions about, especially as you rightly said, it was the last summit was quite an embarrassment for the Chinese. The Lithuanians, there's questions about how long Lithuanians will actually remain members, how future summits will look. But I mean, let me ask you this, because when we actually look at Chinese investments in Europe, the biggest destination, if I'm correct, for Chinese investments in Europe are the Nordic states. And certainly when you look at the share of Chinese investments in Central Eastern Europe versus Western Europe or indeed Northern Europe, it's actually the share is pretty small. So my question is, and again, Filip or Jack, Nadia, feel free to come in also, is the 17+1 actually an issue, or is in many ways 17+1 used also as in many ways to complain about sort of Central European states, while not necessarily talking about Chinese presence and Chinese and contacts between China and the other member states.
Yeah, but I mean that was one of the another excuse is kind of and they still fight for the inability of EU to form a policy on China. Like one is Trump, another like even now I keep reading that 17+1 is like main instrument for China to create divisions in EU. Like what planet you're living on? That's just not reality. So of course, you have Hungary, for example, that's very pro-China member state, but it doesn't really have to do anything with 17+1. So in general, if you look at the region, there are actually more countries that are now at least skeptical towards China than being enthusiastic about the cooperation. And really, we need to go back, like 10 years ago, like what China actually wanted to achieve here, and it has been presented, also as like an economic initiative, but it's not really been that. It's mostly been about symbolics about symbolism for China. So basically, they get all these leaders together. Not this year, but they get all of them together. They meet with Chinese Prime Minister at the time, and it's a manifest to China being a great power that can organize such a meeting, that can like create such a format, of course, and this has been really representative of China being more ambitious, more proactive on the international stage, something we have seen already beginning before Xi Jinping became the leader. But now we see really that most of the countries in the region never saw China as kind of some kind of strategic partner, despite some strategic partnerships being actually that's like a form of Chinese terminology to define the partnerships. So, for example, China has a strategic partnership with Poland. It's not looking really that strategic to me, but so these states were expecting really economic benefits. These did not come, and they did not look to China as some kind of alternative, like definitely for the US, for example, in security, because China just cannot provide the security, of course. And also for the EU. So some kind of complementary, market for experts, and also some boost to the economy via investments. None of that really materialized. Now they have their own concerns about security aspects, for example, Chinese presence in 5G. Many countries like Czech Republic, also Slovakia with the new government, the Baltics are very sensitive to human rights issues, the symbolism of Taiwan, and this has always been there. It was kind of hidden for some time, after 2012 when China really entered the region, but now it got back to surface. And it's actually funny when you read like Chinese literature on the format, and they have always said that the big challenge for China in the region is that they're very hostile. Like the CE countries, very hostile to China in terms of like ideological, what they call it, like differences, and and they have really tried to fix that. When you look at the 17+ activities, a lot of this is like people-to-people exchanges, all of the stuff, basically trying to improve China's image. Like the think tank that Chinese Academy of Social Sciences basically established in Budapest, they do this yearly, I think, report on views of China in the region. So I think it's also a very good. It illustrates well that China has been putting a lot of attention into how it's viewed here, but it's the views that we have seen based on various polls are that China's image across the board, I mean, of course, with some exceptions, actually not Hungary, for example. Hungarians are very negative views of China, which is interesting, but like in Serbia, of course, but still in general, it's been a favor for China, and it didn't help, you know, when you look at the important issues for China, like 5G, of course, like most of the countries are now moving to limit Chinese vendors, Huawei's participation on 5G rollout. So what did it really achieve? And now we have the biggest success for China in the past decade in terms of relationship with the EU, in terms of the investment agreement, and it has not been the CE countries pushing for that. So, you know, let's get to discuss like the real issues.
Yeah, and Jack, Nadia, do you guys maybe want to come in on what Filip said?
Yeah, I think Nadia, go ahead.
Okay. Well, a lot of actually very interesting points. Maybe just very briefly that the kind of elevating of the China's image abroad internationally, and it helps China very much to elevate their image domestically. And we have to remember that perhaps the symbolism is really not only towards kind of portraying China as an international global kind of rising power, but it really helps especially also domestically towards their own citizens. So I think keeping this mind of this interconnectivity between the foreign policy and the domestic policy, I think it's quite important to understand China's behavior. But as we were discussing, I mean, there's a geopolitical competition, and you can turn almost every second item in the house, you know, made in China, and like there are things that will continue to be imported and exported. And I will just be very brief on this and say, as Filip, like really focus on those issues that do matter, that are more strategic concerns, and where we actually do have a common interest to make sure that our democracies are not undermined in the longer period of time.
Yeah, and then just to tag on that, I mean, it's not really my place to talk about, you know, shortcomings of European politics because I'm not a European, but
please do.
But I mean, it's like apart from the 17+1, I mean, kind of what other options are there right now, right? It's like you have like the 1+2+1, essentially the European Commission, France, Germany, and China is actually more or less negotiating on behalf of Europe. And so if anything, the 17+1 could be considered, if anything, like a kind of a loss of an opportunity because of like, you know, there's not more coordination among the 17 beforehand to try to sort of increase their bargaining position vis-a-vis China and actually perhaps get their voice heard. But because of sort of the lack of economic ties between China and the region, it's a little bit harder for either side to kind of really inflict any pain on each other. So, you know, if anything, it can be used to a greater extent in order to sort of stand for political values, which I think it's been underutilized up to this point.
Thanks. Well, listen, I really enjoyed this discussion, and in fact, so much that I didn't notice that it's already got pretty dark, and I need to turn the lights on slowly in my room. But maybe let's conclude our discussions here, and let me, because I think, you know, from all the different spin-offs, I think there's so many different spin-offs we can go into. I think we can really go down a rabbit hole in this discussion, and which actually only just reaffirms me that we need to have another such session perhaps later on in the year. And I hope next time also do it in a hybrid way where we can have a physical meeting as well as an online meeting and have a good drink afterwards. But maybe before we conclude, I mean, let me maybe ask you all sort of a very sort of quick question. And if you could answer maybe in 30 seconds, each of you, you know, in terms of, I mean, as Jack said, you know, he's a skeptic in the short term, but an optimist in the long term, and I like that. So, you know, if we are to focus on the transatlantic approach, and I think we shouldn't necessarily give up, I think we should continue to try. For you, what would be the sort of key priorities, the key key areas, if you like, your top 5 in terms of a transatlantic approach to addressing China. So I don't know, each of you, 30 seconds. I don't know, whoever wants to kick us off. Filip, you look ready.
Yeah, always ready. I think I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I'd go with 5, but I think it's important to say that we really need to have a positive agenda, and not just, you know, like because a lot of this talk about resilience and everything, and it's important. It's very important. And also, I think actually the EU, and why you said, Igor, that, you know, we've been kind of very pessimistic about also the prospects for EU, like real, like becoming geopolitical actor, also after the investment agreement. But before that, like, things were actually moving in a positive direction in terms of like improving the resilience of the EU, like with the investment screening mechanism, you know, with also, you know, the EU sanctions regime, like all of these issues, and some of them are still like being kind of hammered out, like the issue of due diligence in like supply chains, all of these issues. So it's actually that there's been some progress done, and let's not like disregard that and say that we have not moved anywhere. We have really made a lot of stuff done. But what we really need to do is really to stand for something and not just against something. So I think also in terms of the international role that we're going to have, another point made today is that, you know, China is actually, maybe China is not that like in terms of, for example, the COVID diplomacy, it's not that successful in the Western Europe, but what about the global South, you know? But this is where like the fight for, you know, hearts and minds is going on. So also like we should really have something to compete with the BRI, whether it's a connectivity strategy or whatever it is, you know. We need to like get together to really to make our like technological base stronger, to be proactive and regulating, for example, the big tech. All of these issues where there also needs to be there should be a transatlantic approach. So I think, again, just to summarize, and there's a need for a positive agenda.
I mean, I can just, I think Filip stole a few of mine. He was looking at my notes, but no, I completely agree.
There you go, there's a transatlantic approach already, excellent.
I completely agree with the sort of like a laser focus on the global South. That's really central to competition while also strengthening democracy back at home. But dedicating more resources to consolidate, to spread and consolidate democracy. You know, but that's no surprise coming from me, coming from IRI. So, but there's actually a few more places, you know, perhaps like that are more against. Just like you said, due diligence and supply chains is actually a huge, and just sort of sharing knowledge on that. But also coming up with a sort of set of standard procedures for public institutions to continue to engage with China, because it's like engagement is expected, but we can do it in an open and transparent way. But also, I think that something we hadn't talked about today was also support of the Chinese diaspora, both in Europe, United States, and around the world, and sort of protecting independent media in those communities that increasingly are coming under the pressure of the CCP to sort of align with the party's line on a lot of these issues. And of course, continuing to invest in our capacity of China literacy.
And building on all those great points already, I think I would also start at home, address the internal vulnerabilities that we already know about, the loopholes that exist and that we can fix. So to avoid the exploitation of those vulnerabilities by any malign actors or authoritarian regimes that would aim to do that. So starting from home. Second, having a comprehensive strategy, so the political, economic, and security strategy. So not thinking of this kind of separate boxes of this is just the economic issue, this is the security issue, but really thinking in this holistic way and having this comprehensive combined strategy. Also, it's very important, I think, that because of the focus of China on the artificial intelligence, that all the allies, our partners, democracies develop their own national AI strategies. So we have our own way, as we said, kind of more affirmative, proactive approach to these issues to maintain or develop edge if there is not enough of it internally. And that's how our countries will be also more competitive, and we will not need to have this dependency questions and considerations and therefore concerns. And I'll just come back again to also the point I mentioned. Keep in mind always the partners, really the partnerships, I think, necessarily also, beyond the transatlantic community can really make a lot of difference in being better prepared, having the understanding and also approach that, in the kind of alliances, there is strength. So I think I would end on the partnership side.
Absolutely, yeah. And guys, well, listen, thank you very much to all three of you for being here, for joining me today. I really enjoyed this discussion and I hope we can continue in it. Thank you also for the great work you're all doing, your organizations. I think it's the practical stuff you're doing, but also the knowledge creation, a generation you are all doing. I think that's absolutely important, as Filip said, so that we do have more knowledge about China, the CCP, and Chinese and CCP's role around the world. But in many ways also actually about China, because also we need to be careful that we don't turn China, discussions about the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party into a xenophobia. I think we also need to be very much careful there. But let me end on that note. Let me also thank everyone who stayed with us on Zoom, everyone who joined us on Facebook and YouTube. We had a pretty great audience. Thank you to all the questions, and I apologize in case I missed any questions from Facebook. I apologize. This was largely due to the fact that we've been flooded during the discussion by comments from some fake accounts. So if I missed anything, I apologize. Blame the fake accounts. Let me also say that we, as I said, the NATO 2030 discussion it's a series, and the next discussion will be on the 9th of March, on Tuesday, 9th of March at 4 p.m. where we'll be discussing with another great group of experts. We'll be focusing on defending NATO's eastern flank. So that's the next part in our discussion. And all I can say is just thank you very much again. I'm going to finally turn my lights on because it's pretty dark over here. And thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much to all the participants. And I look forward to future discussions. Take care, all of you. Bye.
Thanks.